Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of At the Table. Today, we have a very, very special guest on, a dear friend of mine, Maja Dlugolecki. Maja is a painter and founded a project called Lobster Club, a gallery that hosts events and residencies alongside artists all across the world. Maja is somebody I've personally drawn a lot of inspiration from and somebody that will continue to be a voice of the art world the next few decades. I hope you enjoy. Maja, it is such a pleasure to have you on. I have learned so much from you over the course of our friendship and was trying to figure out where to start this off. Thought about stories, but honestly, because of how much you mean to me, I just have to start by giving props to the person you are, the community that you've built for yourself and your craft. So number one, thank you for your guidance along my journey. And to begin, I want to take us back to the early days of Maja. You've obviously succeeded in so many different ways. Was it like that from the beginning? Middle school, high school, college, were you the natural born killer that you are today? Or was that something that you evolved into?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. The feeling is mutual. So proud of everything you've worked on and thrilled to be here. Um, I started playing the violin when I was 4 years old. So I think that, growing up in a family where my dad made music strings, like grew up in a very kind of pretty artistic, art forward family. Mom was a landscape architect. And so I grew up kind of with like a discipline, I would say, of, practicing every day. Like, not that I always wanted to do that, but, that was something that was kind of ingrained at an early age. And then growing up with the family business, like the first floor of our house in Oregon was, my dad's studio. And so I would say, growing up, we had a lot of kind of like a different, I don't know, my parents just kind of raised us differently than I think a lot of American kids were, where, my mom was an immigrant from Poland. Our dad was second generation. So we had sort of this, like a mix of both worlds. And I think I would say that the person that people see today is very different than the kid growing up. But I think I think that at the end of the day, you always feel kind of the way you felt growing up on the inside, even once you're an adult and people see you as successful and you're doing all these things. But I think that's a beautiful thing too, right? Because it's like I do carry all those parts of me from, being a kid. But I did a lot of music was kind of that main focus really up until college. I was the concertmaster in orchestra. Like that was the way that I'm a painter now. That was like everything, private lessons and, so like solo competitions. That was very much so my world. But I realized in college that I didn't really want to do that. Like I felt like there was something more, but I just had no idea where to start. And so college was just a series of like, 7 different majors: communication, business, international studies, German, super random. Just like trying to find like a lot of like failure really to find kind of what it was that I was after. And then eventually I landed on graphic design. And, the school that I went to, Portland State, the program was a lot more about like pushing creativity than it was technical kind of school, which you usually find in the design world. So, which was great for me because I really was more of like a figure out how to use the programs, but be really creative within them. And, the business side of me was always kind of, I think because of our dad's business, and like I'm sure Tajo has shared the stories of us. We had a backyard with a garden, and so we would, sell vegetables, $1 a pound for string beans, and that was, it was like as a kid, you're going door to door, you're like kind of up to face to face with rejection, potentially somebody not wanting to buy the veggies. Like it sounds so silly, but that was, I think, a really good practice for us, as we got older to have that at an early age. And so, yeah, I think, once I was in college and then kind of figured it out with design, it really was kind of a springboard for me to be able to utilize a skill and be able to sort of start to build like my own freelance business from there. Um, so I started going on Craigslist, and I would find someone who needed a logo for $50. And, I wouldn't necessarily know how to do it, but I would go on YouTube and I'd figure out how to, use Illustrator to manipulate it to make the logo. And, once that would go well, then like the next time I would charge $100, and I would sort of like, in my own way, sort of like build this business. And I was doing that when I was still in school. And so then by the time I graduated, I kind of had this like mix of, freelance clients within branding that was kind of floating me. And I was like, cool, I can just like work remote. And then eventually I was at a friend of mine was working at Nike and got me a job there in their incubator program. So it was like basically building these small little design identity kits for their startup accelerator, and did that for a while. And then, yeah, I mean, to get back to your question about being a killer, I mean, I think it was something that just kind of came over time. But I think my parents really instilled that at a pretty early age.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your father's studio space.
Mm-hmm.
What specifically was like the craft there?
Music strings. So it's like the early string music movement, like the greats like Paganini would play on these strings.
Wow.
And yeah, he's like one of 2 or 3 people in the world who still make these types of strings. And so he started that here. Actually, he grew up in Utica, upstate New York, and then moved to Manhattan in the 70s and the 80s. My parents met here through a Polish classified ad in the late 80s,
Wow.
which
Wait,
is
talk
such a
about
crazy
that.
story. So my mom moved here in with her boyfriend at the time of 8 years, from Poland. And she was a landscape architect back home. And then, I think she was like 33 maybe when she moved here. And so even though she studied English and, was a landscape architect back in Poland, it was really hard. It's just like such a cutthroat industry here. And so she ended up just working for this wealthy woman in Westchester, and, was kind of cleaning and taking care of her, cooking. And my dad, grew up in a Polish community, and he just like loved Polish women, and he knew that that's what his destiny was. And so, my mom's partner was a doctor, and he just didn't like the States. And so they broke up, he left, and I was like, well, I'm going to stay here, keep my green card.
Start
Um,
scrolling through some ads.
yeah, she's like, I'm going to make the most of this. My mom is very much like loves to just juice everything out of life. Which I really admire. I think that's really, really special. And so she was like, I'm going to just see through my time here. And so she put an ad in this Polish newspaper called the Nowy Dziennik, and it's still circulated in like Chicago, New York, places where there's like a big Polish community. And my dad also put an ad in the paper, and my mom responded to his ad, but like called him and left a phone number, but she actually left the wrong phone number. So she left the phone number of this guy that she worked with, who was into her. He was the driver of this woman that they both were working for. And I was like, oh, like we're both Polish. Like we should just get married and, make a life together here. Like Americans don't understand us. And my mom wasn't really into him. So anyway, when my dad called, he was like, I'm sorry, you have the wrong number. Like, I don't know any Sophies. So my mom just thought that he never called her back. And my dad was just like, wow, that's such a bummer. Like she left the wrong phone number, you know? And the crazy part of the story is that a year goes by from that first connection, or misconnection rather. And then her green card's expired at this point. This is probably like the summer. My dad's going on dates. My dad has like a notebook where he's like taking notes of all these dates that he's going on. And so my mom is like, okay, if I don't meet someone by December, like by the end of the year, I'm going to go back. So she puts that on the paper, same paper. My dad also puts it on the paper. It's like printed next to each other. I need to find this listing. Like I have to go back to the archive to find it at some point. But they are printed side by side, and my mom's having like coffee with her friend Jadwiga, who's like likes to kind of like stir the pot a little bit. And she was like, "This is so funny. I think this is the same. This is like the same guy that I reached out to that never called me back." And Jadwiga's like, "You should call him. You should see." And so because she had my mom do that, like that's why I'm here right now. So my mom called and is like, and my dad's like, "No, I have it written right here. Like I tried you a year ago." And then yeah, after they went on a date, my dad was like, told his family he found the woman he was going to marry. This was like in the summer. I was born in May, so it was a pretty quick engagement. They got married the day before Christmas Eve in Manhattan, and then they moved out to Oregon.
It goes to show the scrappiness back then.
No photos.
Yeah.
Like a couple sentences.
Especially being like immigrants, right?
Mm-hmm.
And wanting to connect with your community, but not having the same resources we have today. Like it probably took so much more effort.
Early days of like online dating.
Yeah. But what a great story.
Yeah.
From growing up, what do you think you learned from them and the household that you guys were raised in that carried forward into the experimentation with Tajo and things that maybe you still carry today?
Yeah, I think that, my parents, just like everybody, like we get a little bit from both of them. And so I think while my mom was super nurturing, like honestly, both my parents cooked a lot. We had, like I mentioned, we had a garden in the back. And so, because our dad the workshop was at home, like we would have all our family lunches, like those were our big meals. We would have those together. My parents would take turns cooking. And, I also feel like Taj and I are kind of that last generation where we didn't have phones for most of our childhood. So, I remember just having conversations, and chatting. And then I think, so my mom kind of had instilled that like nurturing side. And then my dad was a lot more kind of the business acumen. And, he worked 7 days a week. And we witnessed that, because it was like in our house. But we also, we still had this importance of family time and connection. And we traveled a lot as kids. We went to Mexico, we went to Europe. We would spend a lot of time. We actually we didn't have health insurance. My dad was like, we're gonna go on educational family vacations and we're gonna eat fresh vegetables from the backyard. And
we'll buy them from you for $1.
Yeah, that's your insurance. Like, and the only time that I actually had health insurance was during college because it was required. But like before that, we would just pay out of pocket.
Wow.
And yeah, I think that it was a really interesting balance because we also grew up in a Polish community in Portland. So, we grew up going to a Polish Catholic church, which was like, we were really going there more so for the traditional elements. But we grew up with a bunch of kids who were, had both their parents had immigrated. They were growing up in this culture where, strangely, my mom was actually one of the few parents, I think maybe because my dad was Polish American, where we grew up speaking Polish, but a lot of the kids that we grew up with, they're Polish. Their parents were so focused on assimilating. I think that's changed now, where it's like people see the value in, being bilingual or even trilingual. But that was like a recent, I think, shift. But I'm really grateful that, we grew up speaking that language. Unfortunately, Taja is not as good as I am because we obviously just, grew up here and started, would speak English. But it feels really nice to have that kind of link back to our heritage and something that just feels like another part of us that's really special to honor,
And bred into all these other sides of you that started with experimenting and the business side, but also just like values that you guys carry today. Um, you mentioned violin being like an instrumental part of your creative journey. At what point did you start experimenting with painting? I think you said in college, but what did that look like?
Yeah. It's actually this month is actually 10 years since I started painting.
Wow,
Yeah. So
congratulations.
just it's crazy that it's been that it's like short but long at the same time. Um, so I think, I feel like I remember growing up and these people often ask me if I took art classes growing up. And another thing that I learned from my mom was we always did a lot of arts and crafts at home. Like we always made homemade like wrapping paper around the holidays. And like I just remember the whole kitchen table was just like all these different like paints and paper and just getting messy. And I've always enjoyed working with my hands. I think that's part of why, playing the violin for so long. You know, Taja and I and my mom, we all, well, like it was a family business. So we all worked for my dad, for better or for worse, family business. So fun. Obviously still doing that today. But we worked with, I worked with my hands a lot throughout, helping with the strings or playing the violin and, even like chopping vegetables. Like I think that's such an important part of living is using your hands to create. And so, what I found when I was in the design program was I was always drawn to incorporating organic elements into the branding. So for example, we did like a chocolate bar packaging and it was about the brand and the logo, but I didn't care about that. I was like excited to paint these like the packaging and these different kind of like textured packaging, which is really kind of is like my early days of painting is that was kind of when I started to experiment with that. I just didn't really realize it at the time or even like creating stamps for like I just enjoyed integrating that and scanning it in and bringing it into and still today, I feel like even with Lobster Club, it's like we have handwritten elements because I think that's so important in like a very tech heavy world. And so, but really like the big jump. So I was at Nike for a bit and then
Ooh. Cut.
I was
Nike.
that's okay. I was
Sorry.
like, it's all
We
good.
just had a nice painting fall off my wall. It's perfect. I actually hope we got that in the wide shot. We'll include that. Sorry, you were saying you
That's okay.
started
So
working at
I was
Nike.
at Nike for a bit and then I was going through my first heartbreak and I was 23. Wow, 20s, what a time. Um, and I just was like, I can't look at my screen. Like I can't look at the computer. I just need to do something that feels cathartic. And I think I was also playing the violin maybe a little bit at the time. But I just was like, I'm just gonna paint, and so that's kind of how that started was just using it as a way of getting my feelings out onto paper, on
Mm.
canvas. And so this was in Portland. And this was at a time too when, Instagram was relatively new and Portland is such a supportive design art forward community that when I started sharing work and I had a few friends who were like, oh, like, are you selling it? And I was like, I never really thought about it that way, but sure, why not? So then that kind of started to evolve where I would sell a painting and then somebody was like, oh, well, like, can you like commission something that's similar? And again, it was totally an experiment. Like I had no idea how to price things. I was like going back to Craigslist where I'm like, okay, like I start low and then can like gradually build up with demand because to me that just made sense. I feel like whether it was design or even music, even with, the violin, I was just attuned to, like I forget what it's called, but I could kind of like play something based on knowing the melody, but I didn't know why. It was like,
Mm.
there's definitely a word for that, but just a lot of experimentation. And so I think that the same thing happened with work when I just started kind of like learning to paint and kind of gradually building, a collector base.
What did the first paintings look like? Was it similar to how your
You don't want to
style.
know.
No, no.
No, I mean, it's just, it was experimental, you
Yeah.
know?
But how
I,
did you tap into that experimentation? Was it like you had, 4 different colors and you were trying a bunch of different shit and over time you learned like I like this, I don't like that? Or what
think
did your process
I
look like?
was really, and I think still today, I've always been drawn to like blues and greens. And I think part of that is growing up outside of Portland where, it was just like a lot of greenery, a lot of oceans, lakes, rivers. And so I think that, and it also those colors just have so much feeling in them. I was always kind of wary of like pinks and purples. I was like I'm not girly. I'm just funny. My shirt's kind of pink, but this is by accident because I accidentally washed color with white, and now I'm like, oops. So now like half of my clothes that I have in New York are pink, like light pink.
But that's such a Maya move to
Yeah,
just embrace it and
yeah,
then rock
just
it,
whatever.
and it looks great.
It's fine.
Doubled in value.
Yeah. But yeah, I think I was really, and still today, like I always talk about my work where I never know what it's going to look like. It's not, I don't go into the studio with the idea of what the canvas, the finished piece will look like. So it's really me pulling colors just in how I feel in that moment,
Yeah.
and then that's why oftentimes, commissions can be really difficult because somebody loves a painting and I'm like, I blacked out when I painted this. I have no idea why, like what colors I mixed to create this or how how many, and my work is also very layered. So there's also that element to it where the work just kind of changes over time. The colors change. And I'm usually the only person that really witnesses that, which I think is really, really special.
Yeah, people see the finished product,
Yeah.
but can't necessarily point to how it got there.
Right.
And
Right.
with commissioned work, it sounds like it's harder to tap into that same emotion. You mentioned
Yeah.
when you started painting, it felt like you were playing violin, but it was maybe a little bit more expressive for you and resonated more. Talk to me about like the emotional piece and like channeling that from something that was, a core instrument, but then
Mm-hmm.
transitioning to a different medium. How did that feel?
Yeah. I think that I always lead with my emotions. Like I'm a very energy driven person. And so I think that my work has always felt like a way that I can explain things that I can't really explain with words through, a visual, like a visual dire essentially is what I refer to my work as. And I think that process is, it's like taking a moment and then even the way that I title my work, like, I have people in my life like Tajo who is just very good at journaling diligently every morning, and I always want to be that person that can stick to that cadence. But for me, it's more so like I'll write out a line from a love letter, or like I'll overhear something in conversation or a line in a song, and so then when I'm working on a collection or even just a painting, and then I'm not really thinking of that when I'm painting. I'm just sort of in the moment. But then when the work is completed, I look back at the entries from that time and then I kind of match them up. So it's kind of like subconsciously what I was feeling and then what I was like thinking, like connecting the two in one space. Um, and I think that my titles too, there's a lot of people are drawn just to that. And they're intentionally vague, because I think that something that's really beautiful about abstract work, and not in just in general, I think when you look at a painting, you're looking at it from your lived experience, right? And so like the blue that you're seeing might make you feel happy, sad, like regardless of how I felt in that moment. But sometimes I think the title can allude to things that still are from your own perspective, but I love that because I think it's an invitation for people to like sit with themselves. And I think in a world where, and I'm 100% guilty of this myself, like just like always go, go, go. Um, those little moments of introspection are so necessary, to be in, and
Yeah.
to give yourself the opportunity to do that.
Do you feel like you were always in touch with that emotion, or how did that antenna, if you will, or channel evolve over time?
Hmm.
Does music help you maybe tap into it, or
So
are there things that you do to
I
naturally get to that
often
state?
I'm always listening to music when I'm painting. I often will play classical music, actually. Um, but sometimes I'll play, something that's not very classical. But I love, like beach house. Like that's kind of always my go-to ethereal music that kind of transports you, and that takes me to a place where, I my work is, when I'm painting, that's one of the few times that my brain is actually just quiet. It's like, for me, that's like my meditation in a way. And so, sometimes when I'm out of the studio a lot, I'm like, oh my God, like I need to like just be back in the studio for a bit, to have that peace. Um, but yeah, I think it's such a beautiful way to be able to really like sit with my stuff.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really important point, which is the best kind of art and creativity is when somebody is in touch with their own unique self versus seeing other people and, wanting to imitate, but instead like actively going away from that and like following your own intuition. And you've done a beautiful job of that. I, obviously have not done that in my in my painting. you're
No, of
you're
course you
staring at
have.
a D minus version of Maya's work behind me. But in my own experimentation, that was a way that I got introduced to the world of painting, right? And obviously, like, I think as you become more ingrained into creativity and art, that first step can be imitation, but evolving into a person that channels from within, I think, is important. But I wanted to talk to you about some of the people that maybe you looked up to early on and how you got your style eventually. Was that through experimentation, or did you start from a similar place of seeing something you liked and then taking your own form?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I also think, just to touch on, like, your work, I think that it's really
We
important
can't even
to.
call it work. It's
No, but like that's like the
my
point isn't even of
yeah.
like comparing it to, like, comparison, right? Is just like, really, it's an opportunity to connect, and a lot of people don't even, I wish more people would experiment and, pick up a paintbrush and get their feelings out on a canvas. Like, I think that would make the world a better place, regardless of if you ever share it. I think that's something that's lacking in our education system, is just having this like place of expression. It's just like another form of therapy, and it's not about making a career out of it. It's really just about another form of expression. Um, and I think that for me, I mean, of course, like I love the Frankenthalers, like all the Abex movement. I think that her style and her work and her body of work has always been like my greatest kind of beacon, and North Star, in in the way that her work really transports me and others. Like I just went to the LACMA the other day, like just to see her painting. Like I went, looked at it for 10 minutes and left. Like that was I just wanted to have that experience. But what I find really interesting, and what I speak to artists a lot about in mentorship, is, when I started, I felt like I really needed to have, I needed to have like a specific like color palette and style that I stuck to, and like that cohesion was necessary for success, right? Whatever success looks like. But what I realized over time is, like, if you look at the Frankenthaler collection over time, there's so much work that looks nothing like what she's known for, like Jacob's Ladder. Like there's, and so I think there's this beautiful and necessary element of pushing your work. And I compare this to, especially in your 20s and 30s, but really ideally your whole life. Like every 6 months you're evolving, you're changing, you're a different person. And it's kind of crazy to think that like your work wouldn't reflect that, you
Yeah,
know?
totally. You're not
But
boxed in.
no, but I think that's something that it makes sense. It looks good on a grid. It looks cohesive to have, I like people kind of were like whatever about Instagram now, but I feel like early days it was like it needed to be this like perfect everything. Which is just not realistic,
Hmm.
and can be conducive really to pushing your creative process. Um,
And people are drawn to authenticity. And that's what you're
100%.
speaking to is
100%. And I think that it reminds me of something that I think Taja wrote about in his like 28, like climbing Cringe Mountain. Like
mhm.
I mean, we've all experienced that. Anybody that's jumping and like taking a risk, I'm sure people were like, "Oh, like you're a painter now that you're like posting, these experiments on Instagram and, and yeah, like the people are all I think a lot of people get caught up in understandably how they're going to be perceived, rejection, I still grapple with that when I'm inviting new artists into Lobster Club. I feel the resistance of like, oh, like I'm gonna send the email tomorrow, send the email the day after, because I'm like, oh, and what if they say no,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, that
And I think
failure.
that's yeah, I think that's like the little Maya in me is still, I experienced bullying as a kid. Like I think that's part of for me, like a really important part of building Lobster Club has been um just like creating a community where people feel like they're a part of it. And I think that's, supper, like I think that that's like a ethos that's like super super important, but ultimately it comes from my own like experience growing up. And I think yeah, you continue building and you grow and people see you one way, but I think that the way that you move the business and grow is like so much because of that core, and who
Hmm.
you're at
Yeah.
or who you were growing up.
We all experience rejection throughout our life, and a lot of life is how you shape that perspective.
Yeah.
Do you approach it with balance and use it as motivation, react in a way that doesn't represent, who you are as a person? But
Yeah.
before getting to Lobster Club, I wanted to touch on the moment you left your marketing job to go full time as an artist. What was that aha moment for
Mm.
you where you were like, this needs to be something that I'm doing full time? And for other artists that are potentially thinking about that, what advice would you give them?
I think that it's funny when I think about aha moments. I think there's the moment of getting my own studio when I was still in Portland. Um, I I was just like, okay, I had a teacher that from Portland State in the design program who had a little studio in her studio that she was able to rent out to me for like $600. And I was like, oh, I can't afford that. And she was like, I'll do it for 500, which was still a lot. So I found someone to split it with. And I was like, okay, 250 a month. And now I just need to like sell enough paintings, sell a painting to make rent. And then once I did that, it like opened up my world because people were able to come into my space. And it was just going from, working in my living room for a couple years, which was great. It was like a starting point, but it was like an investment in myself. And so that's something that I'll oftentimes encourage artists to do is, if you want people to take you seriously, you need to take you seriously. And so investing in yourself in even in a really small way, is really the first step, and that can even be, just making a small space in your space. It doesn't have to be a studio, but I think that's really important. And that's because through my own experience, that opened up a whole world for me where people were like, oh, this artist has a studio. That legitimizes this person, you know? And then the other part was, so I think that was kind of, when I was in the studio, I was kind of 50-50 design and art. And then eventually got to the point where I was like, okay, I can like do this full time. But I kept graphic design on as a supplement for a few years. And I still, it's like, I'm so grateful that I got that skill, even though I didn't end up doing it. My dream when I started the design program, this was probably like year 3 of college. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do this in 2 years. And I'm going to like work at Wieden and Kennedy. And like, I had a meeting with the director of the program. I was like, this is what I'm doing. And I'm like, I'm so glad that that's not how my path turned out. But I was so sure in that moment that that was what I was going to do. And then, so many other things happened, but I think, not to totally veer off, but I think that it's just funny when you sit in like where you're at today and you think about all the things that you wanted at some point in your life and you're like, oh, I'm so grateful that that didn't actually happen because it was such a blessing, even though it felt so disappointing
Right.
in that moment.
Yeah. Not attaching to that outcome and idea,
such a hard
and
lesson.
having the flexibility to be like, that is maybe a goal.
Yeah.
And once you realize it, shifting directions. And that's what you're speaking to.
Right. And so then the next part of that was, let's see, I had met someone in New York and then they moved to LA. So we were kind of doing this long distance thing. And then let's see, March 7th, I moved Tajo down because he was moving to LA for a job. And I was like, well, I'm not going back to Portland. They're shutting things down for 2 weeks. I'm just going to stay here. We were living in Venice at the time. And so then I just accidentally moved to LA. And so throughout the pandemic, like we were really lucky to have a backyard and a front yard. And I was just painting day in, day out. And like people would come to my house and pick up work. And it was just this like, it was like there was so much happening at that time, but then it was I've talked to a lot of artists who have had this experience of, as messed up as the world was, it was like for an artist, just your own internal, to have like 2 years of just focusing on your work and not having any distractions was a really beautiful experience,
Yeah.
albeit at a really awful time in the world.
You mentioned to mentees, some of the core advice that you give is investing in you, getting the studio. I think part of that too is like internally knowing how you show up to your work, but everyone's creative process looks different. So I wanted to ask you, do you rely more on like inspiration in the moment, or do you have like discipline and be like, I'm going to paint from this time to this time and show up in the mornings, or what does that look like for you?
It's a really good question. I think that for me, it's definitely not about, carving out specific hours. It's more so, it can be like, I think because I'm between like so much between New York and LA, it's like every time I move, it's like restarting my routine, which is, I say that I'm such a routine person, but at the same time, a lot of my life isn't a routine. It's just like always kind of moving around. And so I think that when I go into the studio, I do have, like I have kind of my coffee, like my morning ritual. I have that whole thing. And sometimes I just go in the studio and just sit in the studio and I just like look at the work and I'm like, and then I'll read or I'll do emails. I think people don't realize how much of your work, as you probably know, is just a lot of emails,
Yep.
But I do try to give myself sort of sprints of creative time where, I like to work with multiple canvases on the floor. It depends what style I'm working in, but if I'm manipulating layers of paint, then I'm on the floor. If I'm doing more mark making, it's on the wall. And I really like having, a bunch of canvases around me. And then while one is drying, then I'm just like in a flow and kind of going canvas to canvas versus just one. And of course, when you have all these blank canvases around you, you're like, oh, I really don't want to mess it up, But there's also, that's just like the jumping off part, and I just always remind myself that, you know, there's oftentimes I'll like when I'm creating work for a solo show, for example, there's this period. I always laugh about this with other artists because it's like it always sounds so great, and then you're in it and you're like, oh, why did I sign up for this? Because there's so much stress around, wanting it to be everything that you want it to be. And I often find that there's a part where I'm like, I hate everything. Wow, I hate everything. Like, am I even an artist? Like, why am I doing this? And that's just such a part of the whole process. And I always remind myself that. And one thing I also will often say to in mentorship is like, you have to make work that you hate in order to make work that you love. And
wow. Yes. Bars.
and I've said it so many times now that I'm like, is that like,
no,
have I like
that's
oversaid
great.
it? But I'm like, I feel like there is a
I'm
lot
getting
of
mentored right now.
I feel like it's just, and the reason it resonates is because it's every time I've been working on a new body of work, I do kind of have this point where I'm like, I don't really love this. Like something that like I need to, and it's just a reminder to like keep pushing through. And so usually at that point, I'm like, okay, my work is very layered. So I'm like, I just need to keep adding layers, And I mean, it's almost like sometimes I look at my work, like it's like a relationship, It's like you have layers and layers and layers of moments with someone, of trips, of conversations, of difficult conversations. And the more you have that, but you don't give up, it's like you can create something really, really special. And so I, I, yeah, I don't give up on my work, I guess is a way of saying that. And I just continue working on it. And oftentimes the work, like there's usually one piece in particular that I'm like, oh, should I just throw this away? And usually I work on that. I focus on that painting and do so many layers. And something that's nice about it is like you get to this point where you're like, well, this is so ugly. Like there's nothing else I can do to make it worse, Like I can just throw whatever on the canvas
Can't
and
get
like it's
worse.
already in a bad place.
Yeah.
But there's something about letting that go that gives you this freedom to find new palettes and do something differently. And I'm reminded of when I was in Portland, I did a few painting workshops. I would have people blindfold themselves, use like a non-dominant hand, things that I've used when I feel kind of stuck to myself in the studio. And it's just, there's something about just completely like, it's almost like, what is it called when you're like in those water, the tanks?
Deprivation.
Yeah. And you're like, you're eliminating your ability to control, right? Because you can't see, you are using a hand that you're not comfortable with. And I think it's very liberating to like be in that. And so, I find that pushing those collections, pushing that one piece that I'm like, I'm gonna put work into this until I love it again, and I think that's really important. It's important to not give up.
Yeah, the creative blocks for me at least like come up a ton, and it sounds like from what I'm hearing, persistence, and then accepting that you can't control the situation and kind of like letting yourself just run and push through. Is there anything else when mentees come to you and they're like, I'm in this block, I can't get through it, besides the bandana exercise, which by the way, I've never tried, but love. You're going to get a picture of me with a bandana. Just
You should try it. Let me know.
No, I love it. Is there anything else that you've found helps push you through creative blocks?
Yes. I think that sometimes it's not like sometimes sitting in the studio staring at the painting or at your work is not the answer. Sometimes it's helpful and other times it's using a completely different part of your brain. you know? So like walking, like I try to walk a lot these days because it's really, and actually, I don't know if you've ever done this, but sometimes I'll listen to a really boring podcast
A
and
boring
then,
one.
yeah, because I'm like, the goal isn't to listen. The goal is to like kind of tune out. It's kind
Hopefully
of
it's
like,
not called At the Table. Like
uh,
I've been binging your episodes on my walks. Sorry
that's
to
funny.
interrupt.
No, I'm talking like just like I don't know, like history or even like love Huberman, but like I can't listen to it for 3 hours straight. You know, at a certain point, like my ADHD brain just starts thinking about other things, and it's kind of triggering this like. And I don't know. This is just again, I feel like the way that I do so many things is just like Maya style. Like nobody taught me how to paint. Like, I don't even know if I stretch canvases the right way. It's just how I figured out how to do it. And I almost feel like sometimes that's, I always was like, I'll be like cool to go to art school. And there's obviously, the cohort that you meet. I think that's, community, right? It's like something that I always wanted to have. But I do wonder if, like I've learned so much just from teaching myself that. And I almost feel like I don't know. There's different ways of doing it, and I guess that's I've just always naturally figured it out on my own.
Going to live life, and get your mind off something else and then come back
Yes,
to the work. It
yes.
sounds like.
Coming back to the work, and I think yeah. So going on a walk, listening to something, being bored, essentially, like
Mhm.
listening to that different podcast is like a boring podcast is just boredom. Like I remember working for my dad, and it was very like monotonous kind of work where you're just like using your hands, but it was great because I'd be working for a few hours and I would have like a little notepad with like a pencil and I would just be working like tying the strings and then I would have all these ideas pop in and I'd be like, "Oh, I want to work on that so bad right now and I can't cuz I'm like working on this." But I would stop and just like take a note, so that I could do it afterwards. And so I think in this world where there's so many things constantly grabbing your attention, making moments for yourself where you're not distracted and your brain can kind of, explore can be helpful even in painting. Like you can get ideas that way for work, for a myriad of things,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah, you mentioned COVID, moving to LA.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's the beginning of Lobster Club, but before we jump there, I wanted to ask you, in going full time as an artist, people romanticize that idea of quitting the 9 to 5, becoming a creative.
Mm-hmm.
What do they not know about that, jump? And what were some of the lessons you quickly learned into going full time as an artist?
I think that there's just lulls. Like there's just periods where things aren't going the way that you thought that they would, or there's a lot of, I think this is kind of across the board with creatives, but there's so many people who will approach you for something and then you have a conversation and you have this whole thing and then it never happens. So I think there's a lot of just, you have to continually put yourself out there and just trust that eventually things will stick and eventually the right things will fall into place. And that's why, for a lot of people, I'm like, if it's possible to kind of do 50-50 where like you still have like for me like graphic design like being able to like still have a couple clients while I was painting like freed up the anxiety of like being able to know that I could pay my bills. And I took some time. I was like, well, if I'm like things really don't work out, I can always fall back on that. But I think it's, yeah, there's a lot that you just don't realize until you're in it, and it probably looks different for everybody. I was always like, oh, maybe like people just won't really like my work at some point, and but you can't really think like that. It's like
Mhm.
I think you have to keep going, and for a lot of people, I think that there's as an artist, you just you need to get that out of your system. Like you have to, that's how you're like communicating to yourself and to the world. And I think that making space for that, whether it's like, you know, if you're able to save money and then go full time, or if you're able to, you know, work 20 hours a week while you're pursuing that, like it doesn't have to be this like quit everything and then, but I mean, for some people it works. Just like, I'm out.
Yeah.
But you know, I think it's smart for people to have some sort of security net, and that looks different for everyone.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
because I think that the idea of just like fully going in is great, but what you don't realize is that, you know, if you're worried about money, it impacts everything.
Mhm.
You know, it's
Yeah.
really hard to be creative. It's really hard to make the right decisions when you're stressed about finances.
Yeah. And something that I felt was the creative side was great when I had a full-time job and I had stability. You remove the stability and then it's like there's pressure on
Yeah,
that creativity.
exactly.
And so having that safety net and understanding what that looks like is important. The best way that I've explained the journey, and granted I'm 1 year in and have a long ways to go, but for me, it felt like I was on this baby roller coaster when I was in finance. You know, like it was really fun. I had these experiences, also these downfalls, but over time, 1 year in, the highs, it's like the tallest roller coaster in the world because the highs get very, very high and you're feeling great, but then you dip so low coming off of that. And yeah, you just feel and experience more. And I think that's something that you might hear, but until you experience it, it's harder to interpret.
Yeah.
So,
and it never feels like it's enough, you know?
yeah, that high is like you're constantly searching.
You're constantly chasing for that. And we feel, you know, we always joke about like the post Lobster Club show, you know, depression slump, because like there's so much buildup. Even for a project, you know, it's like it's like so still so exciting when you know, I sell a painting, or I sell a painting of one of our artists. Like it feels like such a win, but it's short lived, you know?
Yeah,
And
it's fleeting.
it's fleeting.
Always
And
changing.
yeah, it's always changing. And I think that I'm always, you know, when you're low, it's really hard to remember that like you will go back up. But I think that, you know, I always look back and I'm like, even at the places where I was like, oh, I really am like struggling financially, like I really need something to happen. I think something that's kept me going is like right at that last moment, the right thing has come into place, has fallen into place. And I think that speaks a little bit to letting something I'm working on is trying to let life unfold rather than trying to control everything. Incredibly difficult, but I think is such an important lesson, and creative or otherwise, you know, it's very, we all kind of struggle with that, and just letting things happen, and being okay when it like doesn't go the way you want it to, and trusting that it's happening for a reason. You know?
What are some ways that you try to tap into that release of control?
I think trying to not react in the moment. I think that I often say, you know, when something doesn't make sense, I'm like, okay, doesn't make sense right now, but other things that didn't make sense at a certain point in my life, I can connect the dots now. Like that first heartbreak was so awful. Like I was just like not eating, crying in the shower. Like breakups are the worst, you know? But now I'm like, that was the catalyst for this life that I've built, and my practice and Lobster Club. And you know, even the pandemic in some ways, I think I know that the pandemic for a lot of artists, like that was a lot of where people started, where they were just like they quit their jobs or they were doing both and opened up this new world to them. I think for me, because I moved to LA, which is obviously much bigger city than Portland. But I didn't have community there the way that I did in Portland. And so Lobster Club was really just an idea for like a one night only, you know, big art show where I invite my friends, some who I hadn't met, some who I just connected with online, to, you know, put up one big painting and have, you know, a food installation and invite friends and see what happens, you know? just to kind of sort of to build that. And yeah, I think that, you know, I don't know if that would have happened if everything else before it didn't. You know, probably not. It would be different.
Yeah. One of the things I think I admire about your personal journey a lot is you've built a platform for yourself and have used that platform for a lot of good. You, in my opinion, are a voice of creativity and a lot of artistry. And the way that you shine light towards causes and doing things like the fundraiser for LA and raising, close to $100,000, maybe more than that, through your artwork and through other people, to me is such a beautiful thing. And so, we need more people like that. And the fact that you're leading in that way is beautiful. I think that's a good segue to Lobster Club. It's COVID. You and Taj are in LA.
Yeah.
Probably scheming around doing God knows what.
Yeah.
How did the Lobster start?
Well, it started
That first night.
Yeah,
where
the
you
first
invited
night.
the friends.
I think there was 30 artists. Yeah, you're like reminding
Yeah,
me. That's
I know.
another thing I'm trying
These
to work on.
chairs, I'm like, we got to
I'm gonna
invest
be
in
like
some
hunched
new
over for the
chairs.
first half. And then,
It's a work in progress.
yeah.
I'm sorry. Set you up for failure there.
No. So it started, I mean, yeah, I was painting a lot, and I was kind of, I think that, you get to a point where it's like, if success is great, it's fun, but it is like, especially for artists, it can be very lonely. Like you're in your studio, it's very isolating, especially obviously during the pandemic. And, I really wanted to kind of experiment. And there's also this element of, because I'm essentially like a free agent of my work, most of my work I sell directly to my collectors or, work with art advisors. So I haven't done as many gallery shows as some artists have because it's not as conducive for my practice, but there is something that's really, it's great to have a collector come in and really connect with a piece and take it home, but it's also so fun to have an opening and bring people together, and that energy is just, it's infectious. And so I was like, I'm just gonna find like a cool place, like bring some people together and see what happens. And so we did that. It was November. I think we started planning it in February of 2021, and then November 2021 it was our first show. And so yeah, we had 30 artists. We had all the artists flew in for the show. The artists, it was probably like 50-50 local artists, and then artists from Canada, New York, kind of all over. And we self-funded the show, and then the artists took home 100% of proceeds.
Wow.
And that was, yeah, my CPA was like, this is not a good business. I think you need to really think about this if you want to do it again, because afterwards we had such a great response. We had a write-up in the Times, and we had, the artists, which is really like, that was the core, like the driving force, and still is, of Lobster Club, is that community of artists and bringing them together and designing an experience from the artist's point of view. And so the artists were like, this was so fun. Like, when are we going to do another one? And so we ended up doing, having a small show in Miami that year for Basel. And then the next year we were kind of like, okay, we did a bunch of different, we did a show in New York, in Mexico City. Actually, we did 2 shows in New York. So then we became this kind of like traveling, gallery. And we were like, okay, this is great, but it's a lot of work. And so there was 5 of us. There's still 5 of us at this point. So, we're all like close friends. So it's really kind of like another iteration of like a family business that Taj and I grew up in. He never wanted to like work together, but it was always my dream. And I remember like being kids talking, like in his dream, I'd be like, yeah, it'd be like really cool if we started a business together someday. And he's like, yeah, I don't know. Like we're such different people, and anybody who knows us sees that. But we also, I think that's the beauty of, bringing us our specialties together, and then like bringing in Allison, who does Salud Salud and does these immersive food installations. That's often like the jumping off part I envision when somebody walks into this space. They're like, especially if you're not well versed in the art world and you don't necessarily feel comfortable like in that space, I think that food is something that we all relate to. And literally breaking bread, like the first show is like 300 loaves of bread from Clark Street, and this huge like Lobster Club butter mold. And it was just really beautiful to see people come together, enjoy, something so simple, but something that's like really just very primal as human. And it was so that, like, I always say that the art is like the kind of the first part of what we do, but there's so much more behind that, and I think that's what makes it special.
Art is the vessel to connecting the people,
Yeah.
and that shines through. I'm curious, when you first decided to host the event, did you go into it thinking you were solving a problem? Galleries obviously are a core part of the art world, but it was more of like this fun thing. You gave 100% of the proceeds to artists, but was there an issue that you had experienced with galleries and something that you felt like you needed to fix?
I think that it was less for me of an issue and more so something that I wanted more involvement with something that felt so personal to me. So I think that galleries will always have a space in the art world. They're obviously having to evolve as things evolve with the internet. Um, but I think that for me, especially like working on something start to finish, and then like like the conversation that I have with somebody at the opening, and then even afterwards, like as the gallerist, there's just this connecting part that I feel like sometimes is missing. And I think that a lot of artists we're dreamers. We have these like visions of, again, so much more than just beyond, the canvas, because there's a collection has so much inspiration that goes beyond just what you're seeing on the canvas. And so being able to create that in a space and just completely transform it is really exciting. And then, I think there's the business element where, a lot of artists just don't want to deal with that. A lot of artists don't want to deal with fulfillment and like emails and tracking and CRMs. Like, it's not interesting. I mean, I don't want to deal with CRMs. We have a very talented person staff that handles all of that stuff for us. But I think that there was just a part of me that wanted to take what I had learned and extend it to other artists who, have similar paths of being their own agent. And also there's this element of, exclusivity, which we don't have with any of our artists. I have always felt very strongly about that with my work control. But but I think that, it's something that we always kind of go back and forth on, because I feel so strongly about that. And I think a lot of our artists are at a point where, I never want to prevent them from making a sale or working with somebody that's and I just want to give them agency, because I think artists a lot of times know what the right thing is to do. And if they don't, like, I want them to feel like they can ask and they can talk and it can be like an open conversation. Um, and so that's sort of, I think, a little bit of what we've built is not just like, I mean, I have personal relationships with most of the artists. The original crew of like 30 were all, at this point, really good friends. And so I think, but being able to see just that relationship with them grow to see how, they now have their own network with those people that they met through the shows. It makes me so happy to see that. Um, I think that's the true value of community, is like extending that and introducing people. And I think that when people come to our shows, they feel that warmth, It's like our core of 5 was like a family unit. And then that extends to the artists and that extends to the communities that come out to support. So it's chain reaction.
Yeah. And so important. You mentioned a bunch of different things, and I'm excited to dive in. But in terms of differentiation, what I feel when I go to events is that same warmth that you mentioned. I think the team specifically is really unique. Like the fact that everyone is basically a day one and has stood by your side and Tajo's side for years on end now and are very much a part of it is really, really unique. And I'm curious how you've led over the years and cultivated this culture within the team that feels like a family, because that's something we all try to tap into. Ideally, is like you want people that are invested and, feel like they're part of it. What have you done to amplify that?
I think like there's this element obviously of trust, and I think that there's, people always are just very wary about like be wary about who you go into business with. And um I think it's a very real thing because uh that the dynamic changes obviously, when you introduce finance and money and time and all these things. Like I think that with Tajo, we obviously have kind of different ways of running things. I mean, really everybody on the team is a little bit of like a different personality. And I think that being like kind of that core and having those relationships with each person can be, there's a lot of like kind of juggling a little bit, right? Because you're you're essentially like the glue in a way. Um but I think that at the same time, that's also what makes it so special, is because you care so much that, everybody cares about everybody's success. And I think that, in the early days, like my relationship was strongest with each person on the team. But I think everybody on the team now would say that over time, like we're just such a like unit, and this last show that we had during Freeze in LA, we had this like 12,000 square foot space in the arts district. I think we had like 2,000 folks show up for it. It was incredible. And of course there were fires, like we always say, Steph, our creative ops director, is always talking about how there's always going to be fires, but like if people don't notice, you're doing, that's a job well done, because it's just inevitable. And no matter what, it was just like someone needed something, the other person would pick it up, and it was just that ability to trust and lean on a team. Like it's really hard for me. It's really hard to like, again, like let go and let other people take care of things. But at this point now, almost 3 years in, it's like I can really lean on anybody, and the same goes for like everybody in the team, which is so
Yeah.
special.
Oh, it's amazing. The hurdle bit is hilarious just with events, experiences, whatever you want to call it in general. Like my philosophy is when it's game day and you're showing up, I expect 5 crazy fires every single time. So when something horrific happens and you're just like on your heels, I'm like, that's number 1. And
Yeah.
the next one is, all right, number 2. We're
Yeah.
almost halfway there.
Yeah.
And you develop this idea of like, all right, we can persevere through this and chug along in a way that a lot of times you don't even get to 5, but instead of reacting and being like, there's this
Yeah. Just
craziness.
anticipating
Yeah,
that
you're anticipating
is
and it's going to
huge.
happen. But to Steph's point, I think having that curtain is the importance of premiere production, and you
Yeah.
guys do it excellently. Yeah, when I go to Lobster Club events, like the family feel, also like the aesthetic and the way that Allison brings out the food element, like it's so uniquely done and it feels experiential versus somebody just walking through a space. Like it almost feels like you're guided through the space through cuisine and art, design, and you guys and music, but you guys do that so well. So, um, shifting gears like a tiny bit, I want to talk about pricing work and the intersection of commerce and art, creativity. Obviously, like a huge part of being an artist is understanding your worth. If somebody were to ask you, like, what's the best way to price my work, how would you go about that?
My Craigslist model.
The Craigslist. Yeah.
No, I think that the way, again, it like differs for everyone. And I think that a lot of people would say that, the way people price their work is very arbitrary. Like that the art world in a lot of ways can feel like a black market in that sense where, the prices are made up. Like there's, accolades and there's, your growth as an artist in your career over time that obviously goes up in value. But there's so many things that you can, like the city that you live in, your cost of living, like obviously moving from Portland to LA, that was a big shift for me. And just working with, like, I very much felt like in Portland there was a cap, and LA, New York, it's like there's no cap. There are people who are working on multi-million-dollar developments like at any given time. There's, all sorts of like range of collectors. So I think it really depends on, supply demand is obviously a part of it. And I think that for me, like when I moved into my studio in Portland, um, there's actually there's this restaurant in Portland that the restaurateur reached out. I'm not going to name any names, but reached out about, this was like very early days, probably like 2016, 2017 maybe. Reached out about this new restaurant that they were opening and wanted to include my work in the restaurant. And obviously I was like, oh my God, it's going to be the next hot restaurant in Portland, very much known for the food scene. And so I brought work over and, they selected something, and I think it was like a work on paper, and maybe it was even like a small canvas. And I think I sold it for like $150. And it never went up it never went up in the restaurant. I'm pretty sure they just kept it in their collection. And, it's like but you learn from that, right? And obviously, that was like a long time ago, but I think that you have to like price things in a way that makes sense for like what you need in that moment almost, especially when you're starting out. Like, I think that you can always raise your prices, but you can't really bring them back down. Like that's kind of a bad look. So I think that, and especially like in the economy, the environment, there was a lot of stuff happening with auctions, like during the pandemic, and like work selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then, having the shift now. So I think, and this is not something, I didn't go to art school, but I know it's not something they're teaching in art school anyways. Like this is something that oftentimes artists will ask me about, on calls. But I personally, I use like a square footage system. Again, my style, I have no idea how other people do it. It works for me. And, I always tell people, your commissions should be like 20 to 30% more than your available studio works. And yeah, that's kind of, when you can sell your work, like for me, it made sense for me to sell my work so that I could cover rent, when I first started out. And then I needed to charge a little more because I wasn't doing design, and just like a slow growth over time, I think is the way to do it. And you can overthink a lot of things. You can definitely overthink that, just kind of go with your gut. And another thing I'll say is like, when I moved into that studio in Portland, like it was like kind of like wildfire, and I was selling so much of my work that I didn't hang on to a lot of it. And so what I always tell artists now is, and I will keep a piece from each collection, and just like, if it's something that I really, really love, because I had this realization where I was like, wow, I'm going to like, one day, maybe I'll have a house and I won't have any art to put in it, of my own. And so I think it's really important to, preserve a part of your own history and that process, because it's really, I mean, the early days work, I don't even know, maybe it's in my parents' garage somewhere. That doesn't never need to see the light of day. But there are, it is nice to see, the evolution, the same way that I see it in one painting, but to see that over the last 10 years is also really special.
Yeah. I'm curious, in that same vein is like a business model and balancing creativity with running a business, and over, the evolution of Lobster Club. You guys have done a great job of incorporating new ways to profit, but I'm curious how you think about that, because I think it's easy to get lost in the creativity and deprioritize a business model. And it works for some people, right? There are some people that are like, all right, here's a project. We're going to do the project and see what happens financially.
Yeah.
I don't know how sustainable is. I'm kind of talking to myself here.
I'm like, sounds familiar.
Yeah. But I'm curious,
We have to ask Taj about that one. Business plan? Sorry, I cut you off.
No. I just like, is that something like, how do you think about the business model? Is it something, you obviously have your artwork and
Yeah. I mean, something that I would say jokingly for a while is, I sell my paintings in order to like be able to sell other people's paintings by keeping Lobster Club afloat. But I think I'm very much like an intuitive driven person, and so I think sometimes and this is hard for Tajo. I think sometimes he's like, no, we need like, so now we've instituted like weekly
the P&L
finance sessions, much to
Let's
my
go, Tosh.
dismay. I'm just gritting my teeth through it, but it is important. I think having, if it's something that you're not good at, it's like the same reason, like I have like a fantastic CPA, that an advisor that does everything for me with taxes, anything around that I'm like, I just don't feel confident doing, and I don't want to have anxiety around that. So even though it costs an arm and a leg, like it's worth it, And in the same way, having those checks and balances, like that's the reason that we're probably still afloat, is having that pushback from, the more finance savvy people versus like Allison and I are very much the visionaries. Like, I can't wait for the day when I can just just throw the craziest, just like go all out, Like sometimes I struggle with feeling like, I have these dreams of what I want to do and feeling like I have to do it lean in order to be sustainable. That feels really frustrating for me, because I want to have this like insane, beautiful space in Tribeca and throw like the most insane openings and integrate so many other disciplines, And I know that we'll do that someday, but
Yeah, no, I mean, I think on that point, having that creative constraint of a budget has allowed you to flourish with the little details, incorporating food, developing a community, investing in your team. Like you got the minute details that then over time you can flush into something like the Tribeca gallery. And I think that first step is really, really important of like, all right, we have this much money. How do we make every single dollar count? So anyway,
totally. No, and I think that, there's something I didn't realize was how many vanity galleries exist where they're, oftentimes people are like, wow, like you sell my work so well compared to other galleries that I work with. And I'm like, well, I don't have a choice. Like I have to sell the work. Like that's why, like I have to do this, because I feel a responsibility to like support my team, support my artists. And, I think all things considered, like we really are trying to approach, especially with, the way things are shaping out, to kind of when people are leaning out, we want to be able to like lean in and take advantage of, spaces opening up, or, being able to really take advantage of that. And then when things are really good, like save,
Yep.
so we can kind of like flip that. And so that's that's the plan.
Yeah. Last two questions for you. I've drawn a lot of inspiration from your aesthetic and brand design, and I think that's innate to you. If somebody were to approach you and say, "How should I go about creating my own brand aesthetic?" What advice would you give them?
Hmm. I think experimentation is really crucial. And I don't think that it has to be something that you share with the world immediately. I think that sitting with those experiments and letting them be very it changes things so much when you start sharing things and you open yourself up to um people making judgments, and it changes your own creative process in a way. Like, I often reflect back on those early days where I was not thinking about any of this. I was just in it. And as you build that career, that kind of becomes a little bit more of a fleeting moment, because it's like you have commissions that are a little bit more rigid, and it becomes your job. It's less There's less passion behind it, because it's just like it's a transition, right? um and so I think that being able to stay stay creating a space where you can continually experiment, and whether that's like once a month that you're doing that in the studio, or whatever that looks like. um but I think exposing yourself to as many people as possible too, and as much work as possible. And in I actually think you're really good at doing this, but like really like showing up for people in a way that they're not used to. Like, if you really admire an artist, like showing up to an opening that they have with like flowers, like, even, I mean, it sounds silly, but like, even like, being supportive online, like showing up, like showing people how they can feel seen. um I think can go a long way in like building an authentic relationship with someone. And yeah, I think you're very good at that. You do a lot of
Aw,
research.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think rooted in that too is just a relationship with yourself.
Yeah.
When you do the little things for other people, hopefully and eventually that comes back to self, which is the most important relationship you can cultivate. Last question for you. I know you guys had an open call a couple weeks ago and had like over 1,000 artists apply.
Yeah.
What is
Our Typeform subscription keeps getting pumped up. It's set to automatic.
that is amazing. It's a testament to what you guys have built. Truly, like, hats off to you and the rest of the team. Like, it's such a beautiful concept, and
Thanks, Luke.
the core of what you have built to the point of authenticity is you guys, and that comes through. And it's been so fun to be a part of that. Where is this going, and what are your hopes and dreams with Lobster Club?
Hmm. So many hopes and dreams. They're never ending, as it should be. I feel very, very lucky to love Mondays and, be in this world. Um, what's next, and just to speak to the open call, I think there's so much talent out there, and there's so many people that have something to say. And you know I feel very lucky that we can create a space for that, and in a way that's, like, that we can like test things out, and we can kind of do things in a way that's, you know not a huge risk for the artist, that like they can take a chance on us, and vice versa. In terms of what's next, I think that, I feel like our openings and the ethos of Lobster Club as a whole is very, um hospitality doesn't sound as warm as I want it to, but it's just, I think when people come into certain galleries, it's like whatever kind of wine, like the art can be incredible and like beautiful space, but there's something missing from the experience of like the people that are there. And so I think that we'd love to kind of eventually have a house gallery model, which a lot of galleries are starting to do. And I think that for us especially, that feels very much a Lobster Club type of gallery, because when somebody comes over, when somebody comes to a show, like I feel like I'm inviting you over to my house. Like I'm only going to serve you good wine. I'm only going to like I'm going to treat you like a guest, And so I think that for me in the past, when I had shows with other galleries, I wanted it to be so much more. And I felt like with Lobster Club, we were able to sort of do that and bring that together. So the idea of a house gallery where, someone comes over to see the work and we have a coffee, and then maybe we're having a little lunch together. I think that being able to really build, at the end of the day, build relationships with the people that we're working with the artists, with our collectors, with our community, that's really the strength of Lobster Club. And I'm really excited to see where that chapter is.
Me too. You guys, it's inspiring. And I'll end with again, I've said it countless number of times today, but truly the professional stuff is one thing, drawn inspiration from that, but you as a person and the way that you lead your community is truly inspiring for somebody like me. So I hope you continue on that path. I know you will. Where can people follow along the journey of Maja?
Micah, which is on Instagram. I'm like, how do I spell that? Maijk.
We'll link everything too. Yeah.
Yeah, Instagram. And yeah, that's mainly it, really. Newsletter. We send out a biweekly newsletter on Lobster Club that has new artists every week. And yeah, come to our next show.
Yeah. Any parting thoughts on your side?
I was thinking about, and I wonder if we've spoken about this before, and I can't take credit for it. It's from a conversation with Maya Angelou and Oprah. But just this idea of legacy. And I think that, when you look at leaders and people who make a difference, there's obviously, I like what they said about legacy, which is that it's not the foundation that you build. It's not, the houses that you own. It's not these elements. Like your legacy really lies in all the little interactions you have throughout your day. And there's actually no way of knowing what your legacy is, because that legacy lies with people that you'll never speak to again. It's like one interaction that changed everything, for the trajectory of their day or their life, something that you said that really stuck with them. I think that's such a beautiful way of looking at the world, because it's like, it really is that at the end of the day, it's even just something like when you're checking out at a grocery store, a coffee shop, and there's like a smile, and then you're just like, it literally lifts your mood, and you can pull someone out of that. Someone can pull you out of that. And I think that that's something that we have to hang on to as humans and in humanity.
Mic drop, baby. Maja Dlugolecki.
Thanks.